Very good, thank you. Actually, for many years, I did not know when I first became familiar with wearing a tie as to what the usefulness of that thing might be. But I now know it. It's the best way of clipping on the heads of microphones. I mean, in fact, it's about the only use that I can think of to which a tie is put ever. But anyway, I should apologize because I'm recovering from a pair of eye surgeries, which is only the unglamorous cataract replacement, but actually they also replaced the lens. And with a long past history of mine involving also oral cancer and so on, going back 58 years, I'm not in any great danger at this moment, I think, from that. But it takes some time. So occasionally you might see me. I mean, this one is without remedy on the side. This one is a reading and a middle distance glass. And if there's somebody, since it's quite a healthy gathering, I may not be able to see everybody's faces. And I could change and try my left eye on people. I'll do all those things. Thank you. Well, I think as called rather unimaginatively, I think we agreed on the same title as the title of my book, Idea of Justice. So it's my fault. I should have suggested something different. But anyway, there we are. So I'll get on with it. During the very severe drought in England in the summer of 1816, James Mill, the utilitarian philosopher and father of John Stuart Mill, wrote to David Ricardo, the great political economist of his time, about the effects of the drought on agricultural output and the likely hunger and starvation that will result from it. Mill was worried about the misery that would unavoidably result, he thought, from the drought, the thought of which makes the flesh creep on one's bone. 1/3 of the people must die, unquote. If James Mill's fatalism was striking, so was his faith in the demands of a rather simple version of utilitarian justice, geared only to reducing suffering. I quote from Mill, "It would be a blessing to take them, the starving population, into the streets and highways and cut their throats as we do with the pigs," unquote. Quite a strong utilitarian remedy there. Ricardo expressed great sympathy for Mill's line of exasperated thought, and like Mill, expressed his disdain for agitators who try to sow discontent about the established order by telling people wrongly that the government can help them. Ricardo wrote to Mill that he was, and I'm quoting from David Ricardo now, he was sorry to see a disposition to inflame the minds of the lower orders by persuading them that legislation can afford them any relief, unquote. There was a remarkable exchange of letters between two of the leading intellectuals of 19th century Britain, not just for the language chosen and fatalism displayed by the two stalwarts of British intellectual elite talking about the lower orders, but also for deeper reasons. Even though David Ricardo was almost certainly the most distinguished economist in Britain of his time, the arguments of those whom he took to be mere instigators were actually quite strong. Indeed, those who were encouraging the people threatened by starvation to believe that government legislation and policy can mitigate hunger were actually more right than was Ricardo in his pessimism about the possibility of effective social relief. Indeed, as subsequent economic analysis and public policy making have made absolutely clear, good public policy can eliminate the incidence of famines and starvation altogether. It's not a very hard thing to do either. The big issue here is the need for public reasoning rather than prompt rejection of contrary beliefs. No matter how implausible those beliefs might initially look, and how voluble the crude and rough protest might appear, one still has to examine these arguments, both because they're held by people who feel aggrieved, and also because they might well be right, as in this case. Open-minded engagement in public reasoning is central to the pursuit of justice. Resistance to injustice typically draws both on indignation and on argument. Frustration and ire can help to motivate us, and ultimately we still have to rely, both for assessment and for effectiveness, on reasoned scrutiny of what lies at the basis of indignation to get a plausible and a sustainable understanding of what can be done, if any at all, to reduce the basis of those complaints. The dual functions of indignation and reasoning are well illustrated by the attempts of Mary Wollstonecraft, the pioneering feminist thinker, to achieve what she called a vindication of the rights. Vindication, her first book, 1790, Vindication of the Rights of Men. Second book, Vindication of the Rights of Women, Rights of Woman, in fact, in singular there, in 1792. In both these books, there's plentiful expression of anger, exasperation, and really some bitterness in Mary Wollstonecraft's discussion of the need for a radical rejection of the subjugation of women in particular. The first book, which is about the rights of man, is mainly about those subjugations that apply to men and women together. And here Mary Wollstonecraft discusses the issue of slavery. And indeed, it's quite remarkable that while Mary Wollstonecraft in the second book chastises Edmund Burke for not supporting the French Revolution, in the first book she chastises Edmund Burke for supporting the Declaration of Independence on grounds that you couldn't do that without bringing the slaves into the orbit of discussion. And it's quite a, I mean, she was quite a remarkable thinker of her time. And I must say, even though feminists often do give her credit for originating the subject, she often receives more respect than reading. And indeed, it's not just feminism. It's one of the persons I draw on in my book quite a lot and try to show there why her understanding of the idea of justice was very deep. She's often remembered mainly as wife of William Godwin and mother of Mary Shelley, both of which are true. But she was also a very considerable thinker in her own right. Nevertheless, from anger, Mary Wollstonecraft moves to powerful reasoning, which characterizes both her books, and irate rhetoric is consistently followed by reasoned argument which Wollstonecraft wants her opponent to consider. In her letter to Talleyrand Périgot, one of the leaders of the French political society, to whom Mary's book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, is addressed, Wollstonecraft concludes by reaffirming her strong confidence on relying on reason, despite all the anger. The anger is quite strong. She advises, when she's talking about the inequality from which women suffer, that given where we are, that maybe Britain should revive the trade of getting whips from Russia in order for the mail order to be executed with greater authority. She's very tough on that. And but it never stops there. And the book ends with, and I quote, after consistent reasoning over a number of pages, "I wish, sir, to set some investigation of this kind afloat in France. And should they lead to a confirmation of my principles, when your French constitution is revised," he was disappointed that there was little room made for equality of women in the original Declaration of Rights of Man, "is revised, the rights of women may be respected if it be fully proved that reason calls for this respect and loudly demands that justice for one half of the human race, unquote. The role and reach of reason are not undermined by the indignation that leads to the investigation of the ideas underlying the nature and basis of inequity. And that relates to the point that Brian, very kind, well, by the way, I should have thanked him for a very, very kind, overkind introduction. But in the process, he also made me think that the idea of justice, the concept of justice comes up in so many different concepts. And that's also why it also generates so much indignation, because many of the contexts are one of injustice, which does make a big difference. Even though the investigation leads to, even though the initial thought leads to indignation because of the inequities that characterize the world in which Wollstonecraft lived in the 18th century, and also the world in which we live today. If there's something to complain about, and here I'm straying from my subject matter, as it were, about the intellectual basis of the Tea Party movements that are so active in America today, this cannot be based on the fact that they express anger that the activists display. There can be good reason for anger in many situations, but must relate to the lack of reasoning that seems to follow that anger. And in particular, the distance between the empirical reality and the perceived facts that animate the anger without what appears to be reasoned scrutiny of the arguments presented and the alleged facts that are put forward. But there the excursion ends. I come back to the paper. An approach to justice that gives such a central role to reasoning in general and to public reasoning in particular, which is what also I try to do in my book, cannot but be seen as belonging in some broad sense to an outlook that was particularly cultivated during what is called European Enlightenment, which tended to see clear-headed reasoning as a major ally of making societies decent and acceptable. That diagnosis is indeed correct, but the diagnosis leaves a major issue unaddressed. The leaders of thought in the Enlightenment, European Enlightenment I'm talking about here, even those who were very committed to relying on reasoning, did not speak in one voice. In fact, there is a substantial dichotomy which has not received, I argue, sufficient attention between two different lines of reasoning about justice that can be seen among two groups of leading philosophers associated with the radical thought of the Enlightenment period. By the way, if I knew what Brian was going to say, I would have put in a little bit of a reference on corresponding distinction of the two, on Indian thought, Nyaya and Niti. I did do a paper on that was asked by the American Bar Council, which had a discussion on global rule of law in Vienna, and it was presented. And it's, to a great extent, it's incorporated, but it's also available online as well as other places in the American Bar Council thing. One approach concentrated on identifying perfectly just, this is the European Enlightenment back again, not the Niti and Nyaya distinction in Sanskrit. One approach in the European Enlightenment concentrated on identifying perfectly just social arrangements and took the characterization of perfectly just institutions to be the principal and often the only identified task of the theory of justice. This way of seeing justice is woven in different ways around the idea of a hypothetical social contract, an imagined contract that the population of a sovereign state are supposed to be a party to. Major contributions were made in this line of thinking by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, and later by John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant in particular. The contractarian approach had become the dominant influence in contemporary political philosophy more than a quarter of a millennium later, led by the most prominent political philosopher, and indeed the finest political philosopher of our time, namely John Rawls, whose classic book, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971, presents a definitive statement on the social contract approach to justice. The principal theories of justice in contemporary political philosophy draw in one way or another on the social contract approach and concentrate on the search for ideal social institutions. And this applies not just to Rawls, but also to Ronald Dawkins, Robert Nozick, David Gautier, to the extent you can see A Theory of Justice in Thomas Nagel too. They differ from each other radically, but they agree that that's what the theory of justice is about. In contrast to the social contract approach, a number of other Enlightenment theories, right at the same time, took a variety of approaches that were quite different from each other, but which nevertheless shared a common interest in making comparisons between different ways in which people's lives may go, jointly influenced by the working of institutions, but not just that, people's actual behavior, their social interactions, and other factors that significantly impact on what actually happens. The analytical and rather mathematical discipline of social choice theory, in the early form of which can be traced to the works of Marquis de Condorcet, and indeed other French mathematicians in the 18th century, belongs to the second line of investigation, to which also belongs Adam Smith, Theory of Moral Sentiment, Lectures on Jurisprudence, posthumously published, also parts of Wealth of Nations, Marquis de Condorcet already mentioned, Mary Wollstonecraft, already mentioned, and moving from 18th to 19th century, also John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx. Their approaches were totally different, but they share a certain concern with identifying injustices on which there would be agreement that there are injustices and whether they are removable, and to the extent that they are removable, that becomes the agenda of a theory of justice. Very different agenda from that of the contractarian approach. In this alternative approach, we don't begin by asking what would a perfectly just society look like, as Rawls does, but asking what remediable injustices could be seen on the removal of which there would be a reasoned agreement. One of the limitations of the social contract approach to justice is the unjustified conviction that there could be only one precise combination of principles of justice with specified priorities. And despite the implausibility of that assumption that there will be agreement on that kind of a thing among all reasonable people, that assumption is needed for the social contract approach to justice, because its job is to identify uniquely a combination of ideal social institutions, which you couldn't do if there were differences of views left on the priority of justice. So they're needed. And this actually, as I discuss in the book, gives Rawls some problem later in his second book and later writing. He goes on often to say, well, there are other positions other than my justice and fairness, which could also be emerged that. But we're never actually clear how he would resolve that, well, or even fully admitting or fully recognizing how much it would affect the entire course of action. He was suggesting that you have to get the principles of justice uniquely defined, then the institution, then they all start, legislation, then the execution, then judicial, etc. All the phases come into the story. It's a big story, but if it doesn't start, it's like a car in a wintry morning. You can plan various journeys on it, but it hasn't started. In contrast with this rigid insistence in most contemporary theories of justice, the alternative of the social choice approach allows the possibility of a plurality of competing principles, each of which is given a status after subjecting them all to critical examination. It is, of course, important to scrutinize critically all principles that are presented for our attention, and some may well get rejected after a searching probe, and that's very important to do. But more than one competing principles or competing priorities over principles may actually survive on the basis of their reasoned justification. Indeed, I would argue that there is some naivety involved in assuming that once people's vested interests are removed, which is the way Rawls proceeds, and which is the right step, but then he proceeds to think that once that goes, then they're all going to agree, that there's only one kind of impartial reasoning. Once those vested interests' influence on reasoning goes, then the entire group would come to accept unanimously one specific contract with one fully specified priority or principles of justice on the basis of which the basic institutions of the society could be fully set up to get the story going. Even though some of our disagreements do relate to our personal interests, and also certainly there, right there, and that also applies to Kant and applies to Adam Smith, there are other sources of disagreement among distinct points of view, each of which can claim to have serious implications for the way to think about what impartial reasoning would yield. In my book, I discuss a case, that's in the idea of justice, I discuss a case in which three children are competing for a flute. You have to judge. One of them, I think I called her Anne, demanding it on grounds that she alone knows how to play the flute. Others don't deny it. That's indeed the case. And if that's all you knew, and if you were in a hurry, then I think you quite easily give that to her, because that's a very strong argument. In an alternative counterfactual scenario, it's the second child who speaks first. I think I gave a name with B, like Bob. So Bob says that he's so poor that he has no other toys to play with, none at all. Whereas Anne and the person with C, like Carla, have huge supply of amenities. This flute will give him something to play. If that's all you knew, the argument for giving it to Bob would be quite strong. In a still further scenario, third scenario, Carla says she has been working very hard to make the flute, which she has just done. The moment she finished making this flute, Anne and Bob arrived, trying to snatch it away with all these complicated arguments, of which she doesn't approve. And again, if you knew only that one has made the flute and others are trying to snatch it, you have very good reason for giving it. It's legally, of course, totally definitive what it would do. The question is, morally and political philosophy-wise, what is it that we need to do? None of the claims are immediately dismissible, and a just arbitrator has to weigh the claims of all three competing grounds. No mechanical priority of one of these three principles over the other two at the level of principles could be arrived at a priori, independently of the concrete circumstances and the magnitudes involved. Plurality of reason can sometimes pose no problem for a definitive decision, whereas in other cases it can pose a serious challenge. The case of three children just discussed with the flute, game of the flute, it illustrates the possibility of an impasse in deciding what would be the just thing to do. But the acceptance of a diversity of consideration does not necessarily entail that an impasse would definitely arise. Even in the case of these three children, it may turn out that the child who, in another case, may turn out that the child who has made the flute is also the poorest, or the only one who knows how to play the flute. Or it might be the case that child B's deprivation and poverty is so extreme and his dependence on something to play with so important for a plausible life and for growing up, that the poverty-based argument swamps and trumps to dominate the judgment of justice. There could be a congruence of different reasons in many particular cases, despite the disparate weights on the competing concerns that may be allowed in different impartial judgments, coming from distinct persons on the same, or indeed from the same one. Even, I could entertain all the three of these beliefs, which I do believe poverty removal is important. I do believe that people working hard to do something is quite important. I do believe that giving someone who can make good use of it is a good, waste not, want not argument in favor of it. And a libertarian will have no difficulty deciding what to do, however uncomfortable the libertarians might be in being in the company of Marxist labor right champions who would also give it to the one who had produced it with his labor. Marx would have some problem, though, in the Critique of Gotha Program, his last document, 1875. He contrasts the claim of rights based on labor as opposed to rights based on need, and suggests that ultimately it's the needs which will have to have priority. And of course, Marx believes, he wants to draw attention to the fact, and therefore he fits into my story well, that there are these plurality of principles, and he chastises the German Workers' Party not to see that there is a conflict there. The basic issue here, which is simple enough, shorn of analytical sorry, I skipped the sentence. The idea of justice does, it seems, include cases of different types. Sometimes with an easy resolution, and other times very hard decisional problems. When I come to Northwest, it's very nostalgic for me because I was very involved with the Econometric Society for a long time. I was president of it. I was in the executive for 12 years, and it's run from Northwest. I don't know whether it's still done. That when I became president, I think it was 84. It certainly was run. It was a long time ago, though. And I think it was all in Northwestern-based societies. So I often came here. And these were things that those were days of formative social choice theory as to why partial ordering can be mathematically integrated in to the decision procedure in a perfectly consistent way. That was one of the engagements I was involved in which I got a huge amount of help from others in the Econometric Society and readers of Econometric or Journal of Economic Theory, Journal of Mathematical Economics, and so on. The basic issue here is simple enough, shorn of analytical formalities. It's the need to recognize that a complete theory of justice may well yield an incomplete ranking of the alternative courses of decision. The fact that it's an incomplete ranking doesn't mean that it's not a complete theory. That's what it says. And that an agreed partial ranking will speak unambiguously in some cases, and very usefully in those, and hold it silent in others. When Condorcet and Adam Smith argued that the abolition of slavery would make the world far less unjust, as did Mary Wollstonecraft, they were asserting the possibility of ranking the world with and without slavery in favor of the latter, that is, without slavery. That is showing the superiority or greater justice of a world without slavery. In asserting such a conclusion, they were not obliged to make the further claim that all the alternatives that can be generated about all social institutions can be fully resolved. There was no such claim. I don't believe that they thought that were the case. Slavery as an institution can be assessed without evaluating with the same definitiveness all the other institutional choices the world faces. We do not live in an all or nothing world, and this is perhaps the first distinction I want to emphasize in contrasting the approach I've tried to present in the idea of justice from the dominant Rawlsian contractarian approach of justice and fairness, and that of the other contractarian approaches. I should say, by the way, Rawls is a huge influence on me as a friend, in many ways a teacher, though who was formally never a teacher, but I learned so much, and I've done various classes together with him. My book is dedicated to him, though he disagrees. Though he disagrees with his position. And no one was as keen as Rawls was in encouraging me to finish the book. He knew perfectly well that I'm going to be critical of him, since I'd published already about 6 or 7 Journal of Philosophy papers on the subject, so he had no illusion. But he still went on saying, don't do a collection of papers, because you often are tempted to do it, and economists tend to do it. That's not a good way of talking with philosophers. That doesn't work. You have to write a coherent book. That's the second biggest advice I had given. The other came from Isaac Levi when I was giving a lecture in Columbia in the philosophy department, and I referred to a paper in Econometrica. And Isaac said, Amartya, stop having the illusion that you'll persuade philosophers to read Econometrica. It will not happen. Thanks to the plurality of surviving principles, we may not be able to resolve on grounds of justice alone all the questions that may be asked involving justice. For example, whether a 40% top tax rate is more just or less just than a 35% top tax rate. And yet, not every issue need be resolved on grounds of justice alone. And yet we have every reason to try to see whether we can get reasoned agreement on removing what can be identified as clear injustices in the world in which we live, such as in the 18th century, slavery, or gross subjugation of women, or extreme exploitation of vulnerable labor, or gross medical neglect of the bulk of the world population today. And this has moved from 18th century to today, medical neglect of the bulk of the world population right now, through the absence of medical facilities in parts of Africa and Asia, or a lack of universal health coverage in most countries in the world, including, rather surprisingly, the United States of America, though it might be changing. Or the prevalence of torture, which continues to be used with remarkable frequency in the contemporary world, sometimes practiced by the pillars of the global establishment. Or the quiet tolerance of chronic hunger, debilitating hunger, which prevents full development of physical and mental abilities, even though there is no famine, as it is in the case of India. And the end of the fact that famines are eliminated is cause for celebration, but there are things to do. I've so far been discussing the subject matter of public deliberation of justice, and since there will be Q&A, I'm going to leave it there. I'm already taking more time since I've been a bit slow in presentation. I have to speed up. I now turn to the subject of participation. Whose voices should count in interacting public discourse on the demands of justice? In the social contract tradition, the views that must receive attention have to come from those who can be seen as parties to the social contract, and only them. Given the country-by-country and nation-by-nation structure of social contract, because you need a sovereign state for a social contract to be executed, which was powerfully identified already in the 17th century by Thomas Hobbes and pursued in mainstream political philosophy in the 18th century as well as 19th and the 20th and today. Because of that, the contractarian tradition makes the discussion confined, the voices confined to members of a given polity, in particular the citizens of each country who are engaged in deciding on the ideal institutions and corresponding values for that particular sovereign state. Rawls later goes into the exercise in a later book called Laws of People, and that about how to, actually law of peoples, I think, and that is about relation between countries, but he doesn't invoke justice. It's humanitarianism. Justice is national. Thomas Nagel, in fact, also stated in a widely quoted paper, which had a part in it was Tom and I were doing a joint seminar together, and I said, look, Jack Rawls has been trying to convince me, but you've really convinced me that I have to do this book, because he was arguing that the idea of global justice is a chimera, it's an illusion, because you need a sovereign state for that. They don't have a sovereign state. The question is that right? And that is certainly the contractarian view, Hobbes onwards. It's not the view of Smith, of Condorcet, of Mary Wollstonecraft, or for that matter, Tom Paine. The need for impartiality in the treatment of different citizens within the country has to be supplemented in some way or other when it comes to global justice, in allowing voices coming from far as well as near. The idea of confining impartiality only to the citizens of a state, I call closed impartiality in my book, where impartial consideration is confined to the citizens only of a given country, And we can contrast this with Adam Smith's insistence in his theory of moral sentiment, published 250 years ago, 1759. I was privileged to write a long introduction to the anniversary edition of Smith, which came out by the skin of its teeth in December of 2009, making the 250 years anniversary. And I have a long introduction discussing the reach of Adam Smith's philosophy, which has been neglected both by economists and by philosophers fairly comprehensively. But not just in theory of moral sentiment, but also in parts of Wealth of Nations and his lectures on jurisprudence. And in there, Smith argues that you need an impartial spectator to pay attention to the views of people from far as well as near. And I call that open impartiality. Reasoning coming from anywhere can count. Smith saw that impartial consideration, which must be essential for justice, demanding that we go beyond the boundaries of each state. There are two principal grounds for requiring that the encounter of public reasoning about justice should go beyond the boundaries of a state or a region. One, the relevance of other people's interests, which may be affected by what we do. And two, the pertinence of other people's perspectives and points of view to broaden our own investigation of relevant principles for the sake of avoiding our parochialism based on the values and presumptions in the local community. The first ground related to the interdependence of interest motivated Adam Smith to take up several issues of global justice. He also discusses there in a kind of display of anger, which is really quite extraordinary. Again, this part of Smith, since he's seen so much as a free market champion, is not ever read very seriously. I did give my first talk after coming to Chicago, was a talk on Scottish Enlightenment and Adam Smith and to the British Studies Department at Chicago University. And there I quoted the fact that Smith refers to, at one stage, is so inflamed by the pretension of the white man's superiority, alleged superiority over the intellectual ability of the slaves. And he goes on to say that it's actually a big generalization, using the term Negro, of course, which was common, that there is not and he often made very strong generalization, there's not a single Negro anywhere in the African continent whose ability to understand the demands of justice had levels of sophistication that his, I quote here again, sordid master is utterly incapable even to understand. So it's a piece of real anger in Smith's part. And he thought that not allowing foreign perspective to come in has an element of that concern, that we are self-superior. And living in Britain at that time, which was thought itself as the center of the universe, you can see what that was addressed to. He similarly takes up the English on the sense of superiority over the Irish, but I won't go into it, otherwise I won't be able to finish this paper. The first ground related to the interdependence of interest that I mentioned made Smith chastise injustice, for example, of early British rule in India in the 18th century, describing why it was utterly unjust and that the early British rule was utterly incapable of ruling any country whatsoever. In today's interdependent world, it's easy to appreciate the need to consider our interdependence of interest, whether we consider the challenges posed by global terrorism or by global warming or the world economic crisis that we are currently experiencing. Confining our interest to national deliberations only cannot be the basis of understanding the demands of justice. Also, AIDS and other epidemics move from country to country, as do the medicine, from one country to another. In addition to the global features of interdependent interest, there is a second ground, that of avoidance of the trap of parochialism, for accepting the necessity of taking an open approach to examining the demands of impartiality. If the discussion of demands of justice is confined to a particular locality, a country or a region like Europe, there is a possible danger of ignoring or neglecting many challenging counter-arguments that might not have come up in local political debates or been accommodated in the discourses confined to the local culture, but which are eminently worth considering in an impartial perspective and which have actually been advanced elsewhere. And part of the thing for which Brian was giving me unjustified credit, I saw myself carrying on some of Smith's admonitions, namely to see what the Indian, the Chinese, and the Japanese, and the Middle Eastern, and the African thoughts have to offer to these issues. Smith was particularly concerned about avoiding the grip of parochialism in jurisprudence and moral and political reasoning. In a chapter entitled, and rather revealing, I quote the title of the chapter, On the Influence of Custom and Fashion upon the Sentiments of Moral Approbation and Disapprobation, unquote, in the Theory of Moral Sentiment, Smith gives various examples of how discussions confined within a given society can be fatally limited by parochialism. A quote from Smith. It's interesting, Smith discusses many bad practices elsewhere, including in India and China, foot binding. But when it comes to criticizing on the intellectual ground, he knows what the most convincing would be, to take the people for whom the British have the greatest respect. Who better than ancient Greek and ancient Athenians? Compulsory reading for any public school boy in Britain. The murder of I'm quoting Smith, murder of newborn infants was a practice allowed of in almost all the states of ancient Greece, and even among the polite and civilized Athenians. Uninterrupted custom had by then so thoroughly authorized the practice that not only the loose maxims of the world tolerated this barbarous prerogative, but even the doctrine of philosophers, which ought to have been more just and accurate, was led away by this established custom. Aristotle talks of it as of something that the magistrate ought upon many occasions to encourage, infanticide. The humane Plato is of the same opinion, but all the love of mankind, which seems to animate all his writings, nowhere marks this practice with disapprobation, unquote. His argument here is not that they couldn't think clearly, it's just that they were unfamiliar with a society in which there's no slavery, in which there was no infanticide, which still survived. And there were such societies even at that time, not in ancient Greece, as it happened. And there was not even a general hypothetical argument. What would happen if you change that? There are so many hypothetical arguments in Plato and Aristotle. It's interesting that this one never comes up seriously. While Smith's example of infanticide remains sadly contemporary even today, though only in a very few societies, happily, some of his other concerns have relevance to many other contemporary societies as well. This applies, for example, to Smith's general insistence that, I quote from Smith, the eyes of the rest of mankind must be invoked to understand whether a punishment appears equitable, unquote. Scrutiny from a quote-unquote distance may be useful for practices as different in terms of today as the stoning of adulterous women in Taliban's Afghanistan, selective abortion of female fetuses in China, Korea, and parts of India, and plentiful use of capital punishment in China, or for that matter, the United States. I might mention here that US is an odd company there in terms of its usual statements on human rights and so on. The four top executing countries are China, followed by Iran, followed by Saudi Arabia, followed by the United States. The relevance of distant perspectives has a clear bearing on some current debates in the USA. For example, that in the US Supreme Court not long ago, in the appropriateness of death sentence for crimes that are murder that are committed in a person's juvenile years. The issue is, you can't execute a minor, but he has committed a murder. You wait until he becomes major, and the moment he was major, you catch him and hang him or kill him, electrocute him. The demands of justice being seen to be done, even in a country like the United States, cannot entirely neglect the understanding that may be generated by asking questions about how the problem is assessed in other countries in the world. From Europe, and Brazil to India and Japan. It's important to recognize that to listen to distant voices, which is part of Adam Smith's exercise of invoking the impartial spectator, does not require us to does not require us to be respectful for every argument that comes from abroad. And by the way, the US Supreme Court Justice then, by a 5-to-1 majority, ruled against hanging people, executing people when they become major if they've committed crime in the minor. But the 5-4 majority would have been the other way, when it would have been more than compensated by the fact that the court composition has changed, and the Chief Justice Roberts had already said that was the wrong decision as to why American judges should not listen to points of view coming from elsewhere. It is a distinctly American affair. This is a headlong clash with the Smithian perspective. I'm actually giving a full talk on this in something called the Herbert Hart Lecture in the Oxford Law School in next month on this kind of subject. We may reject a great many of the proposed arguments, sometimes even all of them, and yet there would remain particular cases of reasoning that could make us reconsider our understanding and views linked with the experiences and conventions that are entrenched in a given country or culture. It's the necessity to consider reasoning, not conclusions, coming from anywhere, and not just views and points of view in a given country seen as an island on which Adam Smith puts his big emphasis in invoking the idea of impartial spectator. That open perspective plays an important role on largely Smithian grounds on the analysis of justice I'm trying to present in my own work. Thank you. I seem to have left very little time for quick Q&A. Can we still take some?
Yes, we do indeed have time for
okay, good.
questions. We're going to be seated over here. There should be the microphone right here, and we ask that you speak into the microphone.
Yeah, and I don't want to hold everyone in prison because it's taking longer. You can easily go away and even generate the illusion that you're busy buying the book.
Very good. So we're going to have a seat here, and let me entertain questions from the audience. I'd like to start our discussion. You got a question right over here.
You do announce who they are.
So my question is that
could you just let us know as people ask questions who you are and your relationship to the
Sure, my name is Wayne Chung. I'm actually a former faculty member of the law school. But the question I have is about what one of your co-authors and collaborators has described as the frontier of social justice, Martha Nussbaum. And namely what I have in mind is species membership and animal rights. Because my perspective is that there's been a gap in conventional perspectives on justice that has not been confronted directly in at least
A gap between national perspectives?
Excuse me?
Gap between national perspectives? I'm not hearing properly. You know, sometimes I have to request people to hold it very close. But in your case, in your case, the opposite, further away. Further away, yeah. You're booming in my ears with sound, but not necessarily sentences, so that's my problem. Yeah, much better.
Okay, so I'll start from the beginning. The question I have is about what one of your frequent co-authors, Martha Nussbaum, has described as the frontier of social justice, namely species membership and animal rights. And let me motivate the question by just making two quick observations. Human civilization and society are impacting the natural world in ways that are completely unprecedented. Climate change alone, for example, is threatening anywhere from 500,000 to 1.4 million species. There are tens of billions of animals confined in the most atrocious conditions imaginable in factory farms, even in places like India and China where historically factory farming has not existed.
Yeah.
The second observation is the growing body of psychological and cognitive research showing commonality between human and non-human animals, dolphins being the most recent species to pass the mirror test for self-awareness. So I guess my perspective is that conventional views of justice, especially in the United States, tend to neglect the natural world, the non-human world, Martha Nussbaum, among others, has tried to remedy this lacuna, this gap. And I'm wondering what your idea of justice has to say about the natural world and the non-human world and what we can do to include them, or whether we should include them at all in a conception of justice.
Yeah. Well, I do discuss the question quite a bit in the book. And it's quite relevant for one point that I didn't discuss that issue here in the book in my presentation today. That is what we understand rationality to be. There's a very strong view for rational choice theory which tends to see rational choice as the pursuit of self-interest. And if that is the case, then in order for us to take an interest in the species survival, somehow our interest will have to be affected. But if you take a view, which I think is a Smithian view, though Smith's views are so badly distorted in many discussions, if you take the view that rationality consists of your being able to press for those things which you have reason to support, then that not be parasitic on your own interest on the matter. That is, I could claim that it's very important for me that, bald-headed eagles do not get extinct. But if I were to, that doesn't, in order to qualify that my point of view should count, as in a democratic decision-making it must, I don't have to say that how my own interest is affected, because that's not what the issue is. In fact, I'm not interested in bald-headed, my life would not be affected by a bald-headed eagle, and I certainly don't want any hanging around in my garden either. But I would like them to survive. I think it's a terrible thing, for a reason that you're discussing, that very important species which have taken hundreds of million years to evolve could be extinct. So the way to deal with it is to recognize what our reasoning for that is. And you may be right that leaning outside the Western tradition may have some advantage in that, partly because both in Indian as well as in Chinese thinking, and Japanese too, there have been not this sharp distinction between human beings and other species. And I do quote actually quite extensively a passage from Gautam Buddha in Sutta Nipata, where he is talking about one's obligation to animals, giving an analogy in terms of mother's obligation to a child, not on grounds that the mother has produced a child, but that would say there will be a reason to discuss it elsewhere. But what I'm saying here, that the mother can do many things for a child, which a child cannot, because there is this asymmetry of power, which gives a greater responsibility to human being in a way that it doesn't apply. And all those things, like the factory farm and the torture that you refer to, will fall under this category. So that's the kind of issue that distinguishes the kind of idea of rationality that I also present in my book and in other books, in particular in an earlier book called Rationality and Freedom, that directly links to that question. So I'm delighted you asked that question.
Right back here, please.
Hi, my name's Sam. I research in applied math, and I guess I speak with everybody in the mathematical sciences when I was very disappointed that you didn't have the graph of justice versus that. It was a lot better part of it. But regardless, your talk did hint at parameterization, at least that was my interpretation of where you were.
So regardless of that, my talk being what?
I'm sorry?
I missed the word. My talk is what?
Oh, it hints at the possibility of parameterizing certain...
Parameterizing, yes.
Certain ideas of justice. Whenever you answer a question or you propose a situation that is ambiguous and you give a rational response, that is, in a sense, proposing parameterization. And my thinking is that, like general economics, proposes that that there are people who can make models and be authoritative, much like people in public policy. So the question is, now that we have
good if the questions are shorter.
Between models that we develop and an actual public policy
Sure.
that we can implement. Because you mentioned the Tea Party earlier. There are thousands of people in the world, or millions of people in the world who think that they know more about how the country should be run than 100 economists.
That's certainly true. But I think I wasn't defending what the economists should do. I have talked about that elsewhere, and I think there's no question that I think many ways the economic thinking went very, very bad actually on many of these issues. And when people say, have you revised your view? Well, I don't think I have to revise my view because I never actually expressed these views. In fact, never thought that the market is a self-correcting mechanism, never thought that market polices itself, and being an Adam Smithian, I never read Smith, which main reading is confined to about 13 lines about butcher, baker, and brewer, where Smith is discussing a very minor problem, namely why is it that people have an interest, and basically saying you don't have to be a raving altruist in seeking an exchange. Seeking an exchange. But when he's discussing other things like distribution or production, he's not saying that all you need is pursuit of self-interest. When he's discussing how to not seek exchange but sustain them, he's not discussing that. He's discussing how you need trust in each other. And I have a paper in the New York Review of last year, I think around March, dealing with that, and also why the Keynesian corrective is not an adequate one. But Keynes is, again, not really addressing the issue. I got into a huge problem by saying that Keynes has almost as much to say about social support of human life. No, I didn't say as much. I said worse than that. I said Keynes had less to say on social security than Bismarck had. And as a result, the whole of all my friends in Bank of Italy rose like one man to write immediate letters saying, withdraw, withdraw. You can't insult Keynes like that. I did not insult him. I thought that his book on treaties and probability was his best book. I still think that. It is a very good book. But, and the general theory is pretty good for one or two points, which are quite important. But there are many other things to know. But where our disagreement will arise, that is your belief that I'm trying to say that all the variables involved could be parameterized. If it were the case, I mean, that is in some way the Rawlsian position. It's not exactly, the mathematical structure is not exactly the same because you're not generating a full ranking, you're generating only a top. And ABC and ACB have exactly the same top A, so you don't have to agree to generate on that. But for the same reason, the fact that you've identified top doesn't tell you whether B is better than C or C is better than B, because both ACB and ABC are consistent with A having been on the top. So there is a lot of the mathematical structure to consider here. And one of my complaints is that the kind of maths that economists have tended to use for a long time was so guided by physics, where the nature of the variables are different, that we didn't pay enough attention to the other kind of maths. Of course, ultimately, topology did get in place. Those were very much the matter in kind of discussion that that takes place among mathematicians dealing with structure of set theory, topology, and so on, where partial ordering. In fact, if you take a great classic book of maths of Bourbaki in French, the basic ordering is not a complete order. It's what is called a pre-ordering, which is exactly a partial order, which is what I'm trying to present. And then there are other forms of looser mathematical structure, like fuzzy sets and fuzzy relations, all of which have much greater use in the social sciences than they have in the physical sciences, often, in some physical sciences too. So the right thing, we don't have really time to resolve this issue, is to see that when you're trying to parameterize it, whether you are over-specifying something to the extent that it could not be. And that doesn't mean that you haven't got a unique parameter, means that you can't say anything. You would still get rankings that a partial order would admit. You'd still get things that this fuzzy set and fuzzy relations would allow. I don't go into these mathematical questions in this book, of course, but I'll discuss them elsewhere. And so I think your concern is right, but it's slightly, I hope it's comforting at least to you to say that that's not an error that is being committed here.
Very good. Right over here, please, on the far side.
Hi, my name is Charles, and I am a senior science graduate. And so I specialize in comparison studies, and so when you referred several times in the talk to the issue of terrorism, it occurred to me that there's some interesting intersections with the idea of
Closer.
Further closer.
No, closer. Microphone.
There are some interesting intersections with what you suggested about distant perspectives. In that theory of terrorism, according to some theories, is that it can strike anyone anytime, anywhere. And so I was thinking, is there a way that you can actually have a distant perspective on such a theoretically pervasive problem that really everyone would seem to have a stake in, and how maybe we could use that to think about the idea of distance for a world of such close communication and ties, even across large geographical distances?
Well, I think when you're thinking about distant perspective, you have to be careful that you're not confined only to those which have been forcefully drawn to your attention and to no other. Now, terrorism, of course, inescapably draws an attention to a part of a Middle Eastern tradition which is present in the sense that there has been these cases involved. But that overlooks the fact, for example, that the Turkish Empire, for example, was a very tolerant regime compared with any European empire. It overlooks the fact that when Giordano Bruno was being burnt at the stake in Rome, in Campo di Fiori, for heresy, exactly the same year, the same time, the Indian Muslim king, Mughal Emperor Akbar, was giving a lecture in Agra about the need to tolerate different faiths and not force anyone to take any particular view. And actually, if you discussed it then, it would have looked as if, you could easily see a discussion in Agra as to whether it would ever be possible for the Western world, like in Rome, to understand that inquisitions are not a good thing to do. And it's a completely different world from the one which now is standardly put down our throat by, say, the clash of civilizations and so on. And that's why it is very important to take a broad understanding of different things that have been discussed in the past. And not just that, if you come across the Muslim world only in the context of terrorism, that would be a very limited understanding of what the traditions there are. The unfortunate thing is so dominant is the Western thinking on that today, that even in the rest of the world, that becomes the standard reading, whether it's in Japan, or for that matter, even in Turkey. It may end up being that dominant thing because it's so dominant here in Northwestern and Chicago and MIT and Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge, that becomes that's the way you tend to think of it. So I think it's a hugely important thing to bring in these broader perspectives, the Smithian issue about the need to listen to far as well as near. The need for it is much stronger today than at the time when Smith was writing, where there was mainly lack of interest. On the other hand, not a kind of distorted view of the nature of other civilizations. And then you take the question, as is often happened, it's so frustrating for Westerners when you encounter such things as genital mutilation. How can you deal with that? Well, the point is that there's a lot of the opposition to genital mutilation is local. There's also that any kind of custom that had to be executed by force indicate that there are some people opposed to it. even if you're discussing Iran, to describe the Iranian society's values in terms of only the government, overlook that the fact is government is having to put many people to prison because they don't agree with it. So I think it's that variety of views that have to be invoked in the understanding that is generated. There are two different issues going on. One is to understand other cultures and other societies, and I think the cultural divisions here is very distorting because the differences within a country can be very large between the Tea Party right and the extreme left in the United States. You have a huge variety of views, and that's not much larger if you were to move abroad. And that's one thing. The other thing is the Smithian question, that if you are confined, your thinking would be limited. And I must say, I do think, since Sam Huntington was a friend of mine, though I found just as this one is a critical of all my last, but one book, Identity. No, it was my last book. Identity and Violence was very critical of him. But I did think that to some extent there was a kind of the narrowness of the parochialism of Western thinking is reflected in that book in terms of the Western reading of world culture. It's quite amazing. It's no recognition, for example, of the fact when you say the tradition of Magna Carta. Well, 606 years before Magna Carta, the Constitution of 17 Articles in Japan was pointing out why decisions cannot be taken by one person without consulting everybody else. Languages that are exactly like Magna Carta. So I think it's very important to broaden the exercise in the way that I think you were asking about.
On the far right of us.
Hi, I'm Sarah Smith. I study Middle Eastern history over here.
Okay.
My question is actually tangent to that, but more broadly speaking, terrorism itself as a term has been problematized in that it's a very subjective term. What is terrorism versus what is freedom fighting or justified violence, etc. And I guess my question is, how do you fit violence in general in the theory of justice? How is it made more just for the United States to inflict violence and collateral damage on civilians, any worse than it is for perhaps a terrorist organization to do so on other civilians, depending on whatever their goal would be?
Yeah. Let me say three things in response to that very interesting question. One is that terrorism is, and I'll come back to whether it's legitimate to use the word terrorism, but I'm postponing that for the moment. Terrorism, as the word is used now, is not the only way in which you could do injustice to the rest of the world. No one could regard the American intervention in Iraq to be a terrorist activity. It wasn't in any way. And yet I thought it was a deeply wrong activity. Wrongness can arise for reasons other than terrorism. That's the first thing to recognize. Second, I don't think terrorism is a subjective term. I think there are well-defined uses of the term terrorism when you kill innocent people and who are not involved. That's a big thing. Now, you could raise the question legitimately, was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki a terrorist activity? Because a lot of innocent people got killed. And you could raise that question. That's an important issue, certainly. But you couldn't say that the issue of intervention or continuing to have inequalities of some kind, or not having decent patent laws whereby medicine remains beyond the reach of people, are terrorism, because they are not. And so I think I'm not a subjectivist generally. It seems to me if a term can be used only in subjective thing, then I'm enough of a Wittgensteinian to think that we haven't arrived at an understanding of how what the rules of the game would be. And if the rules of the game are specified, then it's no longer subjective because you're following that rules of the game. That is one of the main things that Wittgenstein's philosophical investigation tries to argue. The third point is to say that it need not always be pejorative. That is, you might say, is that a bad thing to do? And on the whole, I think it is a bad thing to do. But if you might take the view, and that's not ruled out, that terrorism may be in general wrong, but sometimes it's justified. You don't have to say it's not terrorism. And I might mention that as a fact that when Gandhi was battling with those who did think in India that nonviolence would never get India independence, there were people who described themselves as terrorists. That is self-described epithet. Their job was to plant bombs here and there. And they tried to kill the governor of Bengal, for example. They missed. They got 3 other people. But they were not using, they were using the term terrorism, but arguing that whether it isn't justified, it will be justified, given the indignity and the iniquity of the British rule. And they gave a plausible argument. It was a serious subject. There is a novel of Rabindranath Tagore, the poet and a novelist also, called Char Adhyay, 4 chapters, which actually engages on this issue, as to saying why the argument is appealing, and ultimately, like in many of his novels, the protagonist who gives the strongest argument ultimately loses out on the argument as more complexity emerges. So he was arguing against terrorism, but not by saying we dismiss it because it's just terrorism is always bad. He's just saying that terrorism will require justification, and ends by saying that that justification didn't emerge in this case. So I think this is the way I would take your thing, but that doesn't in any way deny, which I perceive as your indignation at some of the things that America may be doing abroad. But that doesn't make them terrorists. But there are so many ways of being bad. And terrorism is only one of them. So there is hope for all of us.
Yeah, right here, please.
Hi, my name is Leo Bessel. I guess you just mentioned Rabindranath Tagore, and I'm not totally familiar, but I am aware that he lived in Shantinikola.
I was born there too, Shantinikola.
I was wondering if you'd speak about his legacy, possible impact on your environmental life. I heard that he might have even named you a Latin.
He did. He did name me. He was a close friend of my mother too. And he wrote a rather touching letter to me when I was born. I mean, I don't have much recollection since I was about 12 hours old then, saying that he was very upset by the fact that everyone uses the same lot of names again and again. We have to start being innovative, and here's a name for your son, which no one had it before, which is true. and it was given that. But I really shouldn't go into Tagore now, because that's not the theme of today's discussion. But I would mention that he was very much a Smithian, the way I'm describing, in being interested in cultures abroad and other thoughts elsewhere. Even in Shantiniketan, when I was at school, my family is from Dhaka in Bangladesh, and first 3 years I spent in Burma, and then 2 years in Dhaka. Then I came to Shantiniketan. I was schooled there until early college, and I was struck by the fact that we were being exposed to, unusually for India at that time, because foreign meant Britain, but we were being exposed to French and Italian, the Japanese and the Chinese. There was a huge China Bhavan, the Chinese studies, the first Chinese studies department in India was in Shantiniketan. The first Japanese studies was in India. The first thing on Indonesian art was in Shantiniketan, sorry, not in India, in Shantiniketan. I knew about Thailand and so forth. So we were being thoroughly exposed to world culture at that time. And that is the connection with the Smithian impartial spectator issue today. But someday you and I could chat on Tagore. I might say also, that you see these days, when they give you the money for the Nobel Prize, the illustrative prize, you have to write a bio, which they immediately put on their website, the Nobel Foundation does. Since Tagore, no one asked that question to Tagore in 1913, there's no self-written bio available for him. So I did a paper in the New York Review, and second time I'm referring to that journal that I often publish there. So, and that was called Tagore and His India. And one way of getting what my views on all these are is to, if you did the Nobel site, Nobel Foundation site, and did Tagore. They put my bio there since Tagore didn't have time to write his autobiography there.
Okay. And yeah, right back here will probably be our last opportunity for questions.
My name is Nico, and I'm a graduate student. Earlier in the speech, you talked about the flute story, and
Which story?
the story about the flute.
Oh, the flute, yeah.
Yeah. So it kind of reminded me of a story in the Mahabharata, where the Pandavas gamble away their kingdom after they make the kingdom really great, and they gamble it away. But then after a big war, they get it back. I just wanted to know whether you thought, is it actually just that they got it back after they had gambled away the entire stuff?
I do actually, oddly enough, you may be surprised to hear, discuss it. Not because I was expecting that you will ask me this question. I have some foresight, but not that much. But I discussed the Gita, because that's about, you may recollect, that's a part of Mahabharata. The story is very interesting, because there's the very powerful warrior, Arjuna, who is going to lead his side to victory. He's one of the 5 Pandava brothers, the third brother, in fact. And he is, by a long margin, the biggest general there. And if he fights, he doesn't doubt that he will win the war. He doesn't doubt that. He doesn't worry about his life. But he asks the question just the day before the war begins, saying, is this the right thing to do? Of course, they have treated us unjustly. We will capture the throne. Would that be the right thing to do, given the fact that so many people would die? A, there would be a lot of carnage. B, some of the people that will be killed by me. I don't like killing people. And C, some of the people I would be killing are people for whom I have affection, because this is on 2 sides of the family. And each side, depending on which part of the clan you came from, were fighting the other. But they were not constantly warring with each other. And some of them, as Arjuna says, I have affection for. I will be killing people that I love. Why? And he says that therefore I don't want to fight. Now Krishna, who is Arjuna's charioteer, but meant to be an incarnation of God, then gives this argument which Gita captures as a separated document, where Krishna says that you have to do your duty no matter what the consequences are. Arjuna is not convinced first, and then gradually he becomes somewhat convinced, and finally he actually gives up and says that I accept the argument. And he goes and fights the war, wins the war. So this takes place not at the end of the war, but before the war. What I argue is that if you look at the Mahabharata, it's not clear that Krishna wins the argument, in the sense that as a religious document, there's no question who wins the argument. But Mahabharata doesn't end there. It goes to what you are describing. The end of the Mahabharata, of the epic, is the just war has ended, they have captured, they're full of, it's a lovely Sanskrit word, doesn't exist in English, aniha, not repulsion, aniha meaning not a desire. There's a lack of desire to lead that life. So with that aniha, they're driven to basically abdicate their throne. And one by one, they all come to an end. The Mahabharata is telling that story, but as they're making a journey through the devastated Indo-Gangetic plain, they see funeral pyres burning everywhere, women in large number weeping for men who have been killed. And it's very difficult to see that the Mahabharata is telling you that Krishna really justly won the argument. So I think it's of course a difficult thing, because Gita is a religious document. I mentioned in the book that when in school, when I thought that Arjuna had a stronger argument, I did ask my Sanskrit teacher whether it is allowable to take the view that Arjuna had the stronger argument and Krishna got away with an incomplete and inconvincing argument. And unconvincing argument. And he said, he thought about it and he said, yes, it's all right to do it as long as you do it with adequate respect. So when I did a Journal of Philosophy paper on why you cannot shoot consequences out, either in the way that Gita suggests or in the way that Immanuel Kant suggested, or much of modern deontological philosophy does, I began by recounting the story there first and saying that I hope that this Journal of Philosophy paper, this was published in 2000, I think, 2000, about a decade ago, more than a decade ago. Well, just about a decade ago. Saying that I hope this whole article is presented with due respect. But with due respect, I have to say that that's not the way I read how the argument went.
Very good. I think that's actually a story from a different tradition. It's a very nice way to end a talk that advocated searching and being open to and inviting in arguments from other perspectives and other traditions. So I want to ask you all to join me in thanking Amartya Sen for a very stimulating discussion.
Thank you very much.